handouts, right? You don't have handouts? Is there anybody over there that could help you with that? And Debbie is going to help you with it. We still got a few. We still got some handouts there if y'all don't have them yet. That's what I just said. You're acting just like me now, see? I'll give you all a second to make sure you got your handouts. And it should say, syllabus, Advanced Heresy 402 on the top of it, but it doesn't. 401. I think that was last week. All right. Okay, so guys, I'm ready to dive in and get started on this. Now there will be a little bit of review from last week. Otherwise, the people who arrived tonight and weren't here last week have no indoctrination whatsoever in this level of heresy, and therefore they will be slow adapters, okay? They'll be slow at adapting if we don't provide some review on that. And so in order to have everyone fully indoctrinated, that's how we have to do this. No, actually, here's the topic. This is what I had agreed to do. We've had some conversations in our staff meetings and some things like that, and I brought up some of the historical things that I've been researching and studying for the past decade or so, and haven't really shared a whole lot other in those conversations. And it's amazing what you can find once you start turning over some rocks and digging up history and willing to look at things with fresh eyes. And so I had shared some different things there, and they said, you've got to do a study and share this information and invite everybody. And so with some reluctance, I agreed to do that, and then they bring in the video camera, and it's all on the record now, okay? That's life. I mean, I'm old enough that I don't care. That's what it comes down to. But it is some exciting material. It's pretty well researched, and you'll look pretty far to find this kind of information anywhere else. I'll try to say that as straightforward as I can. So don't be surprised if it crosses a little bit with what you've always been taught. However, there's nothing in this that is going to go against the Bible. It might go against some traditions, but not against the Bible. It'll reinforce the Bible and bring to life the people of the Bible and the history around them in ways that you may not have seen before. That's why the title of this series, I just decided to call it Between the Lines, because somebody, a pastor colleague up in Kansas City a couple years ago, had gotten in a conversation with somebody, and he was obviously a skeptic because it was outside the narrative that he was comfortable with. And he says, where are you getting all that? I said, well, I read, and he said, no, really, where do you get this? And I said, well, honestly, if you know what to look for, use your Bible and any good set of encyclopedias, and you'll find just about all of it, especially if your encyclopedias were published before about 1974 or so, but before they started, washing things out so much. So anyway, pretty much information. I'll provide you some sources and that sort of thing as you wish. Now, last week, the lesson that we had last week was about a man named Joseph. Do you remember how I referred to Joseph from last week? Joseph the Tecton. Tecton is the Greek word that is translated in our English Bibles to the word carpenter. And so, guess which Joseph we talked about last week? Referring to the family of Jesus. It was Joseph, the husband of Mary. But we learned some other things there too about who he wasn't and who he was and some things like that. And the word carpenter at the time of the translating into English obviously meant something different than what it means to us today. He wasn't a guy who went around with a hammer and saw and cut boards and built stuff like that. We learned that he was more of an artistic tradesman who worked with stones, more or less decorative mosaic type stones, did much of his work in the beautiful town, which was once the capital of Galilee, to town of Sepphoris, which has amazing ruins that you can still see there today with much of the mosaics still intact. And a lot of the mosaics that are intact there in Sepphoris are either geographical or historical in nature, and it's just absolutely magnificent what is portrayed there, even with what's left today. And we believe Joseph the Tecton was one of the craftsmen who had a part in that, and that he also likely, in order for this odd arrangement for him to marry the daughter of Heli Joachim, as named in Luke's genealogy, there had to be something out of the ordinary for that to happen. More than likely, he did a commissioned work for Heli Joachim, and through that was able to get a marriage. Normally, the daughter of Heli Joachim, his daughter's name was what? Mary, that's right. Normally, someone of her status would have married royalty or something very close to that, which is why when she mentioned herself as being of low estate, she wasn't talking about her economic status as a poor peasant girl. Her dad was practically the richest man in the world. Okay, we learned all this last week. This is review. Okay, but when she referred to herself as being of low estate, what was she referring to? The fact that she went outside the bounds of the normal arranged marriage and ended up in a marriage with a tradesman. Okay, that changed everything. Nevertheless, it was God's plan, and that's how it worked out. You'll get a little bit more of that in tonight's lesson, because it's impossible for me to discuss our Joseph that we have tonight without getting back into that a little bit, because all this overlaps. Every one of these lessons will dovetail in and interweave with all the other lessons. So I'm trying to dive into this one and do something to get me segued there. Between the Lines, Part 2, we have Joseph the Tin Man. How about that? Now, I want you to go to the attached page that I've added on the back here, and that's getting a little bit ahead of us, but that's okay. We'll get you caught up. Let's look at that attachment there, and the title of it, it's a song. Now, this particular song, we don't know the original author, okay? However, the earliest sources I've been able to find on this were 3rd century, and it obviously had been around quite a while then. All right, I believe it dates back to the 1st century, early 1st century, but there's no way to prove that, okay? But here it is. I'm going to just read it. You guys, I know you can read, but I'm going to read it anyway, okay? Joseph was a tin man, came far across the sea. He came to buy my tin. His nephew came with him, a lad from Galilee. I'd meet them at the quay. They'd always stay with me. Romans have no sway here, he always used to say. At home, they kill for fun, hang men out in the sun, on crosses every day. That's the Roman way. All rebels they will slay. This is a perfect place here for free men to walk. On nights with breezes cool, he'd sit by a pool, and his nephew would talk in the evening. They'd walk, quietly they'd talk. He hated going back there. I'll return one day, he said. This is the land I love, and this is where I'll live when my work is done, he said. When I'm done with tin and lead, I'll come back here, he said. I hear he's on the marsh now with the church of Wattle Daub. He's found his sacred place, all wisdom and grace, and God in his word. He's living undisturbed, or so I have heard. Yes, Joseph was a tin man, came far across the sea. He came to buy my tin. His nephew came with him, a lad from Galilee, a prophet, seemingly the man from Galilee. All right. So, I'm going to just dig in on this a little bit. How many of you know which Joseph we're talking about already? Wes knows. Which Joseph are we referring to in the song and in this lesson? Joseph, the Tin Man. You know him as described in the Bible as being Joseph of Arimathea. Now, you learned last week a little bit about Mr. Joseph of Arimathea and who he is. I'll insert pieces of that in to kind of build the picture for you as we go through this, but let's start at a good place, simply called the Scriptures. Remember I said the between the lines thing when the other pastoral colleague was asking me about that. I said, well, your Bible and any good set of encyclopedias, you can find just about all this information you want if you're careful in looking for it, right? It's not hidden. It's hidden in plain sight. That's what's so cool about all this info. Okay. And what I said to him is, if you read between the lines, it's all there. You just got to connect the dots. And so that's what I've been doing for about a decade on this particular topic now. And it has awakened me. It has made me more passionate in my own Bible study, brought to life many of the characters of the Bible, and see them much more as real people than I ever imagined I would. So here we are, Mark chapter 15, starting with verse 42. It was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth and took down the body and wrapped it in the linen and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. There was actually one other person, the fourth person there, but we'll get into that later. Okay, so this Joseph of Arimathea was able to go to Pilate and ask for the body of Jesus, and the body was handed over to him. Now, there are a lot of laws, a lot of regulations in first century Jerusalem and within the Roman Empire as well, as about who could do that and how it took place. There is a lot being said here that isn't said word for word. It's between the lines. If you know what you're reading, then you start asking questions and you start finding the answers to those. That's what I'm getting at. For one, Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin. It's mentioned in more than one place, and the passage here in Mark chapter 15, verse 43, is one of the hints we have on that, but historically we also know that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, and there are a couple of other references that he was a member of the council in Jerusalem. We know that to be the Sanhedrin, and by the way, incidentally, it was the council of the Sanhedrin who did what historical trial that they view as a kangaroo trial, basically. Who did they try? Jesus. That's right. At the insistence of the high priest, they did that. And they produced false witnesses. They made up charges against him, didn't listen to the opposition. There are some books written about this, and there were some great arguments that took place. Two of those who argued strongly against the rest of the council were Joseph and Joseph's father-in-law, a man named Nicodemus, both on the Sanhedrin. Okay, we'll get you into some of that just a little bit. But it says he was an honorable counselor, also waited for the kingdom of God. He came and went boldly to Pilate, asked for the body of Jesus. And we know he took the body of Jesus and he buried the body. Get this, only the next of kin could do that. The body could only be, especially of a criminal, someone executed as a criminal, they would dump them over that one valley there on the side of Jerusalem with all the other dead criminals if there wasn't a next of kin who was properly documented who could claim the body. This is how it was done. But only the next of kin could claim the body. Remember, how many of you were here last week? Show of hands on this. All right, better yet, how many of you were not here last week? All right, okay, we got quite a few. And I put a little bit of a review in here on this. I'm going to try to piece this together in a way that makes sense. There are two genealogies given in the New Testament, purportedly the genealogy that leads to Jesus. Both of them leading back in some sense to the throne of David, okay? Matthew's gospel gives a genealogy, and if as you remember that I pointed out last week, that particular line from David down to Joseph, Mary's husband, goes through one particular king that God had cursed and said none of his descendants will ever sit on the throne of David. Okay, Joseph, Mary's husband, Joseph the Joseph the Tecton was a descendant of Jeconiah, the cursed line from David, who would never sit on the throne. So through Joseph, the husband of Mary, Jesus had no inheritance to the throne. But of course, the Messiah must have legal and genealogical connection to the throne of David in such a way they can establish that. Nobody documents their lineage better than the Orthodox Jews. It's very important to them. It was important to them in the first century. And they did not make mistakes on matters like this. So Matthew's genealogy gives you the lineage of Joseph, the husband of Mary, or we call him Joseph the carpenter or the tecton, okay? Now, in Luke's gospel, we're given a genealogy. Everybody agrees, well, everybody's a pretty broad term. Let's just say most serious scholars of Scripture would say the genealogy in Luke's gospel gives you the lineage of Mary. Very clearly so. But guess what? It does not mention Mary. It mentions only men, obviously. But this has been the confusion for years, centuries even, and I have been baffled through Bible college, seminary, almost 2 doctorates, and that's always baffled me. The explanations on this were never satisfactory, but I think I get it now. In Luke chapter 3, actually I've got it in your handout there. I don't really have to turn it up here or look it up here, but I'm going to anyway. In Luke chapter 3, we read this. Verse 23, Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, who was the son of Heli. That's Heli Joachim, okay, who was the son of Mathat, who was the son of Levi, the son of Melchi, going and so forth. This is the lineage of Mary. Now, it mentions here Joseph being the son of Heli Joachim, richest man in the world. In all the explanations I've heard is they said, well, yeah, but they didn't mention the men. They meant he's the son-in-law of Heli. And I said, well, okay, I guess, yeah, all right. Say don't mention the women or whatever. That's how he did it. But there's always something really missing there because we've already got the lineage of Joseph over here. And why is that the big deal? And we don't see Joseph the tecton around after what event in the Bible? Well, Jesus at the temple at 12 years old. We never see him in Jesus' adult life or anything. But of course, we don't see Jesus after that until he's close to 30 years old. He's off and away doing stuff or something, right? Remember, even when people are around, he wasn't truly local because then they were saying, isn't this that carpenter's son? Like he hadn't been around lately a whole lot. So that they were asking the question, and isn't this his brothers and his sisters right there? And isn't that his mother there, Mary? Remember that? So how in the world is it that Luke, the more you learn about Luke, you see that he, of all the biblical authors, made sure to get everything precise. That he would make sure the historical details were in place, and he would always add some other historical item side by side with that to make sure you got it properly dated and in the right context. Very good historical writer, Luke, the physician. The guy was a scholar in many areas. So I started asking myself, so if Luke was that precise, why would he suddenly jump the rails here and go to Heli Joachim's son-in-law and not even put a qualifier in and say that? And finally, I came across some other writers on this, and I started thinking, and I put aside everything I'd heard because I'd never been satisfied with that answer. And then I came to the conclusion of this. Luke, the writer here, Luke, the precise historian, seemed to believe that Heli Joachim had a son named Joseph. Guess what? Heli Joachim had a son named Joseph. That's him right there, not Joseph, the husband of Mary. Mary's brother Joseph, slightly younger brother by most accounts. So how do we get this where it says, as was supposed, the son of Joseph? that Jesus, as was supposed, was the son of Joseph. That's what I want to get into here right now, just to take this further. We did this last week, but this is a little bit of a review. Notice this. Luke 3:23 NIV. Now, Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son, so it was thought, is the NIV translation of Joseph, the son of Heli. King James Version, Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being princess, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, son of Heli. So let's look at that phrase that's translated as was supposed. It simply means to hold by custom or usage, to own as a custom or usage, to follow. It is the custom, it's the received usage. So basically, Luke is saying that Jesus, at about 30 years old, was according to custom the son of Heli. And I'm sorry, Jesus at that age was according to custom the son of Joseph, the son of Heli. Okay? How did that happen? Well, this particular Joseph then is Mary's brother. Now, a lot of this I'm covering from last week. A lot of people have said Joseph, the husband of Mary, was one of two or three things. One teaching, and I reject all of these because they don't square up with what we know biblically. One, that Joseph was an older man when he married Mary. There's nothing in the scripture to indicate that. Or two, that Joseph was older and that the siblings that are mentioned as being there with Jesus and along with the family a couple of times, that those were Joseph's children from a previous marriage, therefore older than Jesus. We have every indication they're all younger than Jesus, and therefore also that Mary is their mother, and therefore, that breaks down pretty quickly. It appears that Joseph the Tecton was a normal age young man when he married Mary, but that he died somewhere between Jesus being 12 and I'm guessing before Jesus reached about 18 or 20. In that span of time, this Joseph died, which wasn't unusual. Normal lifespans in those days in the Middle East just weren't all that long. He was one of those who apparently didn't live very long. Therefore, Mary's brother, who would have been Jesus' uncle, as well as uncle to Jesus' half-siblings, stepped in and took on the legal role of father for the family as being the next of kin and the mother's brother. Not only that, Joseph was a very wealthy man. Now, remember what I said a minute ago, that Heli Joachim was a very wealthy individual, considered at least the wealthiest man in that part of the world, maybe one of the wealthiest in the entire world. I know, and this totally crashes the idea of Jesus being born to poor peasants and all that sort of thing, and Mary was a poor peasant girl, just she and her poor husband, a little broke-down donkey going up to Bethlehem and all that sort of thing. This demolishes that. I mean, the level of wealth this family had. And somebody else, it was Luke Timothy Johnson, the Catholic scholar, who said, a wealthy Jesus family just is an affront to all the traditions of the gospel. And it is. It truly is. And one of my responses on that has been, okay, let's just say they were poor peasants. The day the Magi arrived with millions in gold, all that changed. But even without the Magi, we're looking at Heli Joachim, Mary's father. But get this, Joseph, the brother of Mary, himself had a fleet of ships. And he traveled and traded primarily in oars, and within that realm, mostly in tin ore. If you look at the world at that time, most of the tin and copper ores came from one particular place, and that's where he went to get it. The little song that we just read there, no, he was from Galilee. He traveled to their land. It was in the British Isles. That's where he went. That's where the mines were. That's where the smelting houses were for the tin and the copper and the other ores. Joseph was traveling there and loading up on these ores and trading them all over the Mediterranean and much farther than that. Some of the stories of Joseph have him taking ships to India, others even to South America. There's not as much evidence to support that, although I wouldn't completely rule that out. But he was a man who traveled the world, and he knew what was going on all over the world. Pretty amazing guy, this Joseph. So, do you think it's even possible that a nephew might have traveled with him occasionally? Right? That's what the little song there said, right? I know. Haven't lost you yet, have I? The phrase that is translated honorable counselor, there are a couple of times in referring to him in the Latin translation of the New Testament. That is actually a legal Roman title, nobilis decurio, honorable counselor. And as we dig into that, we find out that this particular Joseph, the son of Heli, was an officer of the mining districts for the Roman Empire. He was to monitor and do some management level of the various mining districts throughout the Roman Empire. So the man had some connections and clout, no doubt. Not only this, he had direct access to a man named Pontius Pilate. They were on pretty good terms. So here is Joseph, after the death of Jesus on the cross, coming to Pilate and asking for the body. They didn't have to document who he was or anything. Everybody knew then. Or at least the people close knew. Guarantee you Pontius Pilate knew. And they gave him the body. Now, here's some interesting things. After the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, they waited around. There was a time of Pentecost and all of that. And the church just boomed and grew there in Jerusalem. But shortly after that, a lot of persecution started. Joseph had been able to protect a lot of the believers and followers of Christ from the persecution and get them hidden and take them places. He had some different homes in different areas. As we get into this deeper, we'll probably have at least three different lessons that directly involve our Joseph, the Tin Man here. But he was protecting many of the believers there who were under persecution. However, much of his protection came from from Pontius Pilate, excuse me. Pilate was removed there in Jerusalem right around 35 AD. And about that time, that is when the high priest and many of the council members, they had already ejected him from the Sanhedrin. But you'll be amazed at what happens next. They took Joseph and a few of the other believers. I might name those before we get through this. There's actually a song about this, by the way. Did you know that? But they put them on a small boat. And one of the important things that is mentioned in every record about this, of the boat that they put them all on, was it had no oars and no sails. And they towed them out into the Mediterranean, way out of sight of land, and left them there. Okay? That was how they exiled him and some of the other leading believers out of Jerusalem. This happened right after the time when Stephen was stoned. That's when the persecutions really got harsh. And who was leading a lot of the persecutions like that in Jerusalem at the time? Our guy, Paul the Apostle, was Saul of Tarsus at that time. Exactly. So here's what happens. The best I can track the story. The boat drifted to North Africa. Joseph had contacts there. He had done much trading all around the Mediterranean ports and everything, and was quickly able to arrange a passage across the Mediterranean where they went to Gaul, or part of what we know today as France. And here's the most interesting thing, and it took me a while to put all this together, the why this happened. There's numerous records that say this happened, but forever I was scratching my head and just saying, how could that have happened? When they arrived there in France or Gaul, Philip the evangelist that you read about in the book of Acts met them there. And there was a huge gathering who also met them there, who were emissaries of King Caradoc or Caradactus, depending on which pronunciation used, over in Britain. Obviously, Joseph had been trading over there for many years and was, quite the business operator. I'll try to get back to that in a minute because there's a lot of cool stuff in that. But they asked him to bring his company, all those with them, and come down there, and they wanted to learn more about Jesus, the resurrection, all this sort of thing, and offered him land and several things if he would do this. Joseph agreed to do that. However, everyone with him did not. They sort of parted ways then. Some of them stayed in France. A couple of them ended up dying there in France, and another one was martyred. Another year, there were actually 12 of them that are named. We might get that in this one, another study. But going back to Joseph's trading earlier in the British Isles with the ores, tin, mostly tin and some copper, and where he was taking those and everything, how did he know to go there and get this stuff? As we find out, that had been for a few centuries the area where you would go for those ores, and the whole world got their tin and copper ore there in the Scilly Isles, they called it at the time, Cornwall, those islands in that area. In the early 20th century, and probably still now, there was a couple of people who were doing some studies there, and there were still ruins of the old brick smelting houses there and the now abandoned mines that are still there, okay, throughout those islands. Do you know what they called the ruins of the old smelting houses? This one would blow you away. They called them Jew houses. Now here's my questions. This was early first century, and they'd been there a long time already then. How in the world did you have Jews mining and smelting tin and copper and other ores in Britain in the first century and prior? We're going to have to do another study on the history of that and how they got there, aren't we? It's pretty fascinating. They were not. They were not. As a matter of fact, this is one of the areas that maintained their independence from Rome for quite some time, which is what I need to get into next, I think. So, in the song, Joseph there is quoting him saying, this is one of the places where we can walk free. Back where we are, the Romans hang people and on crosses and all this sort of thing. This is where I'm going to come after my work is done, right? So here's a backstory on this. Joseph did arrive there in Cornwall about 36 AD, maybe as late as 37, but no later than that. But here is some of what was happening in those years. King Caradoc and his family had been able to remain free of Roman rule, sometimes by some battles where they came and tried to take them, other times through diplomacy, leverage, and politics and things like that. The Emperor Claudius made an arrangement with him, and when Caradoc's first wife had died, he ended up marrying then the daughter of Roman Emperor Claudius. But then, as an exchange to try to keep a peaceful relationship, Claudius adopted the daughter of King Caradoc, whose name was Gladys. Now, he renamed her Claudia. That's going to come up again in just a few minutes. But we read that after Joseph went to Glastonbury area there in Cornwall, which was where Caradoc was at the time, the very first person he baptized there was the daughter of the king, Gladys, and her brother Linus, and several others. But we read that Gladys was his first baptism there. So here's what happened. This kind of overlaps a little bit. Rome, shortly after that peace agreement they had, betrayed Caradoc and captured him and took him to Rome. His daughter was there, Gladys, renamed as Claudia. And some of his family went along there. And they brought him out, and they were thinking that they would publicly execute him as an example to any of the other nations or whoever that were resisting Rome. But he made a speech that was so impressive, and the crowd and everybody shouted out in his behalf, and the senators of Rome and everybody were on his side, and so they determined they weren't going to execute him. But they kept him imprisoned there for 7 years. He ended up going back after the 7 years. But where he stayed while he was there was essentially the British embassy in Rome, known as the Palatium Britannica. And that's where his daughter, Gladys, renamed to Claudia, stayed during her time there, was at the Palatium Britannica. Some of the records of that place talk about it having over 400 employees and servants working in the Palatium Britannica. Just another little aside on that, when Paul wrote the prison epistles, you know where in Rome, you know where he was imprisoned? Yeah. Yeah, he wasn't in a damp dungeon with rats and straw and stuff. No, he wasn't at all. But getting off just a little bit there. So Joseph goes back to the place that he had known, where he had been working and had relationships there, and the gospel was well received there. And of course, they had started a big congregation there. It was really a thriving center of missionary outreach there, and he lived a long life for his age. The guy lived, and I had to keep double checking this because I couldn't believe it, but apparently he lived to be 100 years old. Yeah, and I'm in a little bit of disbelief, but there are a few sources that say he died at 100 years old. Go figure. But a great church grew there in Glastonbury, and it's memorialized now at a place called Glastonbury Abbey on a slightly different location. But what was happening is believers were coming to him from all over to be schooled, to be trained, to be taught, and then he was giving them missionary assignments and sending them all over the world. So get this, over the next several years, all these people were out traveling and doing missions work and taking the gospel all over the world. But when they came back, or some of the people from the churches they had started were coming back, they were bringing the knowledge of all the distant lands and the different cultures and early Christianity, volumes of this they were bringing back, and he began to establish a big library there. The library became one of the most magnificent libraries in the world. Probably very close to the ancient Persian library that was destroyed around 1050 AD in Isfahan, which is now Iran. Great story behind that too, by the way. But this library thrived there and was just probably one of the greatest collections of early Christian and missionary knowledge. And in the 1100s, it was destroyed. And that's when they took even his epitaph and headstone and moved it to the Glastonbury Abbey to memorialize him there. But here's the thing. Look at his first convert there in Britain, Gladys, the daughter of Caradoc, then her brother Linus, and some others. When Paul got to Rome, now think this one through. Remember, Paul wrote the epistle of to the Romans before he got to Rome because he was hoping to get there. It was one of his best written works of theology that Paul produced, because he knew the church at Rome was pretty good size, had strong leadership, and was well schooled in their theology. He had to really present himself well to be accepted there. So Paul didn't start a church at Rome, did he? Matter of fact, the church at Rome had been around. He didn't get to Rome till 60 A.D. Joseph got to Glastonbury in Cornwall about 37 A.D., and within the next few months, Gladys would have been baptized. And it was within about the next 4 years that she would have ended up in Rome. She and her brother Linus then had started sharing the gospel there, and then Gladys, renamed Claudia by the emperor, got married. She married a guy named Rufus Pudens, who was a Roman senator. And when Paul arrives at Rome, he finds the leaders of the church there at Palatium Britannica, and they are named in the Bible in 2 Timothy 4:21, when Paul said, "Do your best to get here before winter. Eubulus greets you, as do Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers and sisters." Linus and Claudia were the leaders of the church there, along with Claudia's husband, Pudens, or Rufus Pudens. You want another little interesting tidbit on that? Rufus Pudens was Paul's half-brother. Different dads, same mom. Anybody believe that? Yep. Yeah, it's in the Bible. Just a second. I don't know if I marked that or not. I think I got it here. Crazy, isn't it? Rufus Pudens. The Pudens who is mentioned in 2 Timothy 4:21, I've got it in your notes there. He and Paul have the same mother, and it's mentioned in the book of Acts. I may have failed to put that in my notes there. I'll look up the reference before we're done here on that. But the thing about it is, Paul just asked someone to pass along a greeting, to share a greeting with Rufus Pudens, and also greet his mother and mine, who is there. And so, but there's other records too that show that. But Paul clearly mentions that they have the same mother right there in that particular writing. There's a lot more that takes place. It will be in some of your other lessons. And we've got a little bit more time here to go over some of this, so I'm going to backtrack and fill in just a little bit. I passed over this. The one British historian, Gildas, from 516, said, "These islands received the beams of light, that is, the holy precepts of Christ, the true Son, the latter part, as we know, of the reign of Tiberius Caesar." And that would have been no later than about 37 AD, and that's 6 to 7 years after the crucifixion. Jesus born in 3 BC and crucified right around spring of 30 AD. And so we get this to be about 6, 7 years after the time of the crucifixion. Reportedly, he died at Glastonbury in Cornwall, July 27th, year 82. Engraved on his tombstone, basically, after I had buried the Christ, I came to the Isles of the West, I taught, I entered into my rest. So apparently he had stated what he wanted for his epitaph ahead of time. They moved that tombstone once after the library there was destroyed, and they moved it to the Glastonbury Abbey, and I believe it's still there today, to the best of my knowledge. So, going back into some of this, the relationship with the family, you've got a few things that cross with our traditions. One is the poor peasant Mary from a very poor family and all of that. Tell me something. Thinking back over the lessons you've learned and what you've been taught, where and when and how did you learn that Mary was a poor peasant? A flannel graph. That's the best way, I'm telling you. I remember those days. But no, seriously, think about it. What? And we covered that. Remember last week, one of the things I covered was, here's some of the reasons biblically and historically we could find where we might be able to say or believe that they were poor. But then we had another side of reasons. We kind of set up as like a debate case. Here are the reasons why we could believe they were poor. Here are reasons we think they couldn't be, right? And so we went over some of that. But any of you remember how you first learned this thing about Mary and Joseph being extremely poor or anything like that? Right, right. They were probably, and here's the thing about it. First century Roman Empire, there wasn't anything between. There was no middle class. You had probably 95% of the people extremely poor, and 90 to 95. The other 5 to 10% were the ones who were in a whole different world. They didn't do business in the same places. Everything was different for them. They were the privileged class. And here's one of the biggest things, and the scholar Luke Timothy Johnson, he says, it's just an affront to the traditions of Christianity to believe this. It's like, yeah, I grew up without much of anything, and lower middle class, working class kind of family, and I always kind of wanted to think of Jesus as carpenter, tradesman, he kind of, my kind of guy, For me to think of him as coming then from a family of wealth and privilege, at first I was like, how can that be? But then on the other hand, to say that what he did, and went down, he just, as I've said a few times, he picked some guys he wanted to hang out with. He goes down to where the fishing boats come in and says, I want to hang out with you guys. Come on and let's do this, rather than going down to the temple or the synagogue and picking the religious guys in the robes and saying, let's all hang out, He did that. But thinking back on our history on that, it puts a whole different take on how we see that family interacting in their world, doesn't it? So anyway, we got into a whole lot of that. The other thing would have been the father here, Joachim, actually was in, his main business was grains. He and maybe a couple of partners, one of those being Nicodemus, were basically had a monopoly on the grain industry throughout the Middle East and possibly, of course, shipping from there a lot of other places too. So they had a lot of means, a lot of wealth there to work with. And Joseph then, as being from that family, then coming of age, being on the Sanhedrin, and becoming probably from his very younger years, just because of his travel and his trade with the mining districts, being named an officer for Rome and monitoring the mining districts. There's a lot going on there. But what happens with this is we start getting into their lives and accomplishments, and you start to realize there are historical records of things that happen in these people's lives. These records don't necessarily go directly to Jesus and paint a picture of him and everything else, but we know that Joseph went to Cornwall, that he baptized Gladys, the daughter of Caradoc, and that she and her brother were the founders of the church at Rome. Now, the records would say this, that her brother Linus, Paul appointed Linus to be the first bishop at the Church of Rome. Well, Paul's about 20 years late. So he comes in and they're already leading this big, growing, thriving church with good, solid doctrine and theology. And Paul walks in and says, oh, yes, I appoint you bishop. What do you think, guys? Just saying. The other thing that it really got me was the leaders of the church were there at the Palazzo Britannica's, what we would consider a British embassy to there. Huge place, apparently, and very well appointed. And when Paul arrived, that's who greeted him. And he worked out of there for quite some time. Now, Luke, our writer, our historian, also mentions that near the end of the book of Acts that Paul continued there. It doesn't name that specifically, but then it says he went to another rented house and continued to teach and preach from there until he was executed. For, I think, another 2 years it mentions. Again, I'm assuming that was a pretty nice place too. Paul in a dungeon with straw on the floor and a big high window that he dreams of getting out of and all this stuff, sitting there penning out the epistles. That's not the story. Crazy, isn't it? All right, about ready to wrap up, but Harold, yes, sir. Yeah, so let's go back on that. King Caradoc was house arrest and stayed there, okay, at the Palatium Britannica. And others lived there too. It was, a pretty massive place apparently. But he actually gained his freedom and went back after 7 years there. But I know, but house arrest was normal there. And part of Gladys, or her new name, Claudia, being there, part of that was like the adoption was kind of an air quotes around that. If you remember the story of Antiochus, who was of the Seleucids, but when they tried to move against Rome and were defeated, his dad and all that, and they brought him in and put him under house arrest, but he was still treated with privilege and everything else, but he couldn't leave, But the whole idea was, well, we'll bring the defeated ruler's son, and he will live here among us, learn our culture, learn to like us, and will be a positive emissary for our values and our way of life. And by doing that sort of thing, we keep the peace. Gladys, the daughter of Caradoc, was there in Rome for much the same kind of purpose. And so Paul there, that's where he was staying. And yeah, you could call it house arrest. I don't know that he really had freedom to go move about the city the way he would like to. He probably could leave there with an escort or something, But yeah, that's kind of how that would have worked. Rome, yes.
And Paul was a Roman citizen, and obviously he had his half-brother was a senator, so that was a factor.
Yeah, there's these factors too. Paul's imprisonment there, you remember once he appealed to his Roman citizenship as having some rights, whereas everybody else didn't. But also, he did have Rufus Pudens there as a senator there in Rome. There's a big ordeal, some big write-ups about the marriage of Rufus Pudens to Claudia, believe it or not. There's poems written about it. There's historical accounts. It was a big affair. It was basically a royal wedding. You got this British princess marrying a Roman senator right there in Rome, And so there are historical accounts of that. It's not that hard to find these things. They're not on the top level of digging. They're about the second or third level, hidden in plain sight, Anything else anybody got on this? I know it's a whole lot to digest pretty quick. Yes, sir. I'll try.
Mark 15:43 says that Joseph was an honorable counselor. Is that the NIV?
No, I think the NIV, just a second, I had that down somewhere. It's a little different wording there.
My question is, what does that mean, honorable?
That is the phrase that the Latin translation uses the official Roman title, nobilis decurio. That I put in your notes there. It is, right, second paragraph on the back page. The Roman title of nobilis decurio. But that is the actual phrase that is honorable counselor in the King James translation. I looked it up today in the NIV, but I don't remember. It's something about, it uses the word counselor, but not honorable, something like that. But the Latin on that actually uses the Roman title of nobilis decurio. I did have the exact wordings of that. The actual wording is something like noble officer or something like that, but it was the title that they used for these appointed officials throughout the empire. Yeah, he had a government appointment there related to the mining districts throughout the empire. Crazy, huh?
So Jesus had insight to this whole class of people. So his rebellion was because he knew so much about that culture.
I don't know if I would actually say it is his rebellion or whatever. Most of who he spoke against were the religious leaders, Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees. He really had vitriol for those guys. You know, you're vermin and serpents. And
I mean, I realize he's the Son of God, but still, that's what God was trying to say what's wrong with society.
well, I believe the message was more that the entire human race was in sin and that the Messiah was coming to redeem the entire world, to die for the sins of the world. So I think the bigger message was that. It doesn't. It truly doesn't. It takes a little bit of thinking to get past everything you've thought of all your life about this, as in being just a nobody without resources or anything like that. But is far from the case. We're going to get into some more of that in the next couple of studies too, expanding out with the family. We're going to talk about Mary Magdalene, who she was and what Jesus' relationship with her was. It's pretty amazing, actually, once you start to put all this together. And once you start connecting the dots, more the dots start connecting, you know. Yes, sir.
Do you think that the churches that evolved kind of massaged or rewrote history a little bit, or was this just kind of, was this malicious, or was this just by lack of paying attention, or how did it get off course? 'Cause
Yeah,
we're going to
good.
say it politically, there's a lot of spin put on it.
Well, yeah, so that's really good because think about this. Christianity, in the early years, the first believers were all Orthodox Jews. They followed the Hebrew calendar. They, for the most part, recognized the Hebrew feasts and all that sort of thing. And the flavor of Christianity was Jewish, and the values were based on the Hebraic traditions, you know, the Ten Commandments, all that sort of thing. So a whole different approach. It was really in 313 AD when Constantine became the Roman emperor and decided the whole Roman Empire was going to be Christian, that they really pushed the historic Roman background, and it had been a polytheistic. They had worshipped lots of idols, different gods. Surely they could include Jesus along with that and say they're all Christian. And they started renaming like the pagan holidays and feasts and some things like that have names that were associated somehow with Christianity or something in the Bible. And Christianity then took on a much more Roman flavor than a Hebrew or Jewish flavor starting about then. And so this gets back into a little bit, you really opened a nice door there, because Rome, the Roman Church, Catholicism, who's responsible for a lot of this, would claim the church at Rome is the oldest and earliest Christian church. Well, first of all, there was the church at Jerusalem. However, it was scattered when the diaspora, the persecution began after Pilate was removed, okay? But then Joseph is pretty quickly in Glastonbury starting a new church there. It predates the church at Rome, and that was readily acknowledged in the early Christian world, that the earliest church was the one planted there at Cornwall, Glastonbury. And of course, then from there, Gladys ends up going to Rome, and she and her brother found and started the church at Rome next. Really interesting. The British royalty are responsible for the two earliest thriving churches. There's some of the history still around there in that part of England at Glastonbury, but it's almost forgotten now. And there's other things that, you know, kind of superseded that. There's something else connected to that I was going to add in. I kind of forgot it. Yes, Wes? Right. That's true. But a lot of that history got distorted. Oh, here's the other thing I was going to mention. when you dig into the history, most of the records you're going to find, they will say, yes, Joseph of Arimathea was related to Mary and Jesus and so forth. The majority of those have shifted what actually happened. And they will say that Joseph was actually Mary's uncle, the brother of her father, therefore Jesus' great uncle. They'll still acknowledge that he was younger than Mary, but will say he's the brother of her dad. You've got to go back earlier than the Council of Ephesus, which was 431 AD, to find the actual records that show Joseph was her brother. Or you can just look at the Gospel of Luke, which clearly states Mary had a brother named Joseph, right? That is one of the early records. But what happened was that's when they introduced the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. And along with that, they didn't make this second one official doctrine right then. It was much later. But that was the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which would mean that she was also immaculately conceived, and therefore her mother gave birth to no other children. Therefore, Mary could not have siblings and keep the Roman doctrines consistent. You'll follow this? It's crazy. Let me go back over that again. First of all, the perpetual virginity of Mary, Council of Ephesus, 431 AD, basically stating Mary never had sex with husband Joseph the Tecton. She remained a virgin for life. The siblings that are mentioned must have been Joseph's from a previous marriage, or they were cousins, because they certainly were not Mary's children, okay? But in order for them to deify her like that, they must have a supernatural beginning for her. Therefore, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Now, when we hear Immaculate Conception, we generally think it's talking about Jesus and the virgin birth. That is not what they mean. They have never once meant that when they say Immaculate Conception. They're saying Mary was immaculately conceived. Look it up. Every day. See? Yep, that's exactly what it means. Every single. But the Immaculate Conception is the Immaculate Conception of Mary, not Jesus. Wow. Yeah. I was shocked when I learned that too. The school there in Springfield is named Immaculate Conception. Oh, that's kind of cool. It's all built around the virgin birth and everything. It wasn't. I mean, in a sense, because they would say, well, Mary was immaculately conceived, therefore, in theory, she had to be virgin born. But in order to maintain that, Mary's mother could not have given birth to other children, therefore, Joseph can't be Mary's brother.
Does all that then help explain it to us Protestants why there's so much emphasis on the Virgin Mary in the entire Catholic deal? Like they honor
Yeah.
we honor Mary.
There's.
All that you're saying is actually true.
Yeah, look it up on the Immaculate Conception of that. Don't just believe because I said it. Look up the Immaculate Conception, what they actually mean by it. It's simple enough to do.
I'd rather just believe it that you said.
And here we go. Don't do that. No, but honestly, just do a Google search. What is meant by Immaculate Conception in Catholicism, whatever, and just read, sort out, get your better sources, whatever. But they make it real clear. Yeah. And I'm sorry they hadn't told you that, truly. Harold.
If I can be retro here a little bit, go back to my initial question.
Yes.
I looked up the NIV translation of
The Honorable Counselor, yeah.
it says prominent member of the council.
Yeah.
It's referring to the Sanhedrin. Is that, would you agree with that? Or?
You could take it that way. Now, remember the NIV is more of a dynamic equivalent translation than a literary translation. Therefore, they're adding some interpretive freedom in how that gets translated. That's why I'm saying go to the words that are being translated there and look at those. And that is the Noblest Curial, which when we dig the background of that up, it was the title for the Roman official.
So the NIV may not
Well, It might be implied, but they're not wrong in implying that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. I'm just not sure that that's what the intent of that verse is. That's all I'm saying. Yes, sir, Gary. Another?
I was just trying to figure out how far up the Catholic hierarchy I would have to go in order to find out people that were informed and educated as to what
Well,
you said. 'Cause here's a gentleman,
yeah, that surprises.
the masses of Catholics,
Right.
they don't necessarily know what the bishop knows or the priest knows.
And I'm a little surprised there because once I looked it up and saw that, I said, oh, I've misunderstood it all this time, you know.
Would any priest agree with what you said or would it have to
I think any priest would certainly be able to describe the Immaculate Conception in that way. Yeah. And any priest would clearly and unapologetically, they don't hide it. It's not a hidden teaching or anything. It's just right out there. And that's what got me. I thought, surely I knew what it meant, but I was wrong. I didn't until 5 years ago, 6, I don't know, but within the last decade, you know. I just never thought about it other than surely it just means the virgin birth. But I didn't get it right. We're going to get in more on Joseph, our tin man, and also a little bit more into his family and his exploits. We're going to talk some about Mary Magdalene and a few other things before we get through this series. So I think it's time to leave since everybody's leaving. So I'm guessing. Thanks for coming, guys. The purveyor of heresy strikes again.